Welcome to this briefing. If you have chosen to follow this content, you likely already have a specific image of World War II deeply etched in your mind. You have seen the classic motion pictures. You have seen the heroic assaults on the beaches of Normandy, the cool-headed pilots in leather jackets, and the resilience of the infantrymen on the front lines. Hollywood and history textbooks often paint this conflict with broad strokes of strategy, heroism, and moral clarity. They tell you about the righteous war. They tell you about the triumph of the human spirit, but they rarely tell you about the mechanics of the end. Today, we are not here to discuss flanking maneuvers, about Axis politics, or the medals pinned on chests. We are here to discuss what happens when industrial-scale destructive power collides with the fragility of the human body. Before we begin, I need you to forget everything you think you know about safety. In movies, death is often dramatic. A soldier is shot, he has a moment to look at a photo of his lover. He utters a few final words and then drifts into eternal sleep. That is a lie. The reality of the battlefield in the 1940s was an industrial slaughterhouse where the human body was merely a soft obstacle. Against the laws of physics and chemistry, there were 1,000 ways to die in World War II, and honestly, every soldier had to face his own private agony. The infantryman feared the mud and the jagged cast iron of artillery. The tanker feared being cooked inside a steel coffin. The sailor feared the bone-chilling cold of the Black Atlantic. And the pilot feared the fire that would fuse his flesh to the dashboard. This is your battlefield survival manual, but I must warn you beforehand that it is a dossier on invisible killers. We will peel back the romanticized veneer and look at the war through the lens of biology and physics. We will examine what really happens when a high-velocity object transfers all its kinetic energy into your chest. We will look at how the brutal cold of the Eastern Front tricks your brain into thinking you are burning. We will analyze shock waves that can liquefy your organs without ever tearing a single patch of skin on the outside. The weapons of World War II were a quantum leap in killing technology, but the human body had not evolved to keep up. We are still soft, filled with fluid and air held together by bones and delicate tissues. When you pit that biological reality against an M1 Garand abounding mine or an incendiary bomb, the result is never tidy. It is organic, messy, and terrifyingly fast. Or worse, it is agonizingly slow. Throughout this series, we will dissect those moments. We will walk through the valley of the shadow of death, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the burning coral reefs of the Pacific. We will listen to the silence of the deep ocean floor and the screaming wind of a freefall from 6,000 meters. This is not designed to scare you for horror's sake, but to bring you true understanding of what that generation had to endure. Their enemy was not just opposing firepower, it was also gravity, thermodynamics, bacteria, and their own physiology. So brace yourself, but do not get too comfortable, because in the next few minutes we will look directly into the darkest face of this global conflict. We will analyze the inevitable. Get ready. The discussion we are about to have will be heavy, raw, and the absolute truth about what it meant to be a living body on the battlefield. Welcome to the reality of World War II. We begin this survival manual right on the ground with the backbone, force of the war, the infantry. If you were standing in the shoes of a soldier in 1944, your main threat was not merely the enemy soldier, but the laws of physics of the bullet he fired. There is a dangerous misconception born from modern cinema and video games that a gunshot wound is simply a puncture, a clean hole that can be patched up with a bandage and some grit. You need to understand that World War II weapons operated at a level of raw power completely different from today's standard assault rifles. The M1 Garand, the German Kar 98K, or the dreaded MG42 did not fire intermediate cartridges like the modern M4. They fired full-power rifle cartridges, massive bullets like the .30-06 or the 7.92mm Mauser. These things were designed to drop a horse at 1,000 meters, and your human body is far more fragile than a horse. Let's analyze the first phenomenon you would encounter: the sledgehammer effect. When a bullet of this caliber slams into a human torso, it doesn't just slide through tissue, it dumps a massive amount of kinetic energy into the target instantly. Imagine being hit in the chest not by a sharp needle, but by a baseball bat swinging at twice the speed of sound. The impact is so violent that it doesn't just break bones, it pulverizes them. If a bullet hits your collarbone or rib cage, that bone instantly shatters into hundreds of tiny fragments. In that millisecond, your own skeleton turns against you. Those bone shards become secondary projectiles, ripping through surrounding muscles, arteries, and nerves in locations far removed from the actual path of the bullet. You aren't just being shot, you are being fragmented from the inside. However, The damage isn't limited to what the metal touches. We must discuss the hydrostatics of flesh, specifically the temporary cavity. The human body is mostly water. When a high-velocity object enters a fluid medium, it creates a shockwave. As the bullet passes through you, it begins to tumble and spin, transferring energy outward. This creates a temporary cavity, a violent expansion of tissue that can balloon to the size of a football right inside your body. This void stretches muscles and organs beyond their elastic limits. You could be shot in the liver, but the shockwave alone could tear a kidney or collapse a lung without the bullet ever touching them. This is why the entry hole can look deceptively small, perhaps just the size of a coin, neat and clean. But the exit hole. The exit hole is often the size of a dinner plate, a gaping crater where pressure has blown the meat out from the inside. But let's assume you survived that immediate impact. Let's assume the bullet hits lower in the gut. In the field hospitals of World War II, an abdominal wound was often classified as expectant, a polite medical term for waiting to die. This brings us to the infantryman's most painful killer, peritonitis. In an era before rapid helicopter evacuation and advanced broad-spectrum antibiotics, a hole in the gut was a chemical death sentence that played out slowly. When the stomach or intestines are perforated, the barrier separating the digestive system from your sterile abdominal cavity is breached. Acid, bile, and billions of bacteria spill into the space surrounding vital organs. Initially, you might feel a strange numbness, followed by a burning sensation spreading like wildfire. This isn't just infection. This is chemical warfare right inside your own skin. The abdominal muscles will spasm and become rigid, hard as wood, as your body desperately tries to guard the inflamed area. Fever hits fast, bringing delirium. You are literally being digested from the inside out by your own gastric juices. It is a death that spans days of unquenchable thirst. Fever dreams and screaming agony that morphine can barely touch. In the mud of Europe or the jungles of the Pacific, this was the reality of the infantryman. No glory, just the brutal calculus of biology failing against lead and gunpowder. If the rifle bullet is a precision assassination tool, then artillery is the raw, indiscriminate fury of a god. We now shift from the infantryman's sights to the chaotic reality of bombardments. Statistically, if you died in World War II, chances are high it wasn't a sniper who finished you, but a high explosive shell fired from 15 kilometers away. Artillery doesn't kill neatly. It offers none of the surgical precision of ballistics. It works by tearing the human body into jagged pieces or crushing it with the very weight of the air. First, we must distinguish between bullets and shrapnel. A bullet is aerodynamic, copper-jacketed, and smooth. Shrapnel is nothing like that. Artillery shell casings are thick layers of cast iron designed to shatter upon detonation. When that shell explodes, the casing fragments into thousands of superheated metal shards razor sharp and irregularly shaped. These fragments don't spin on a stable axis like bullets. They tumble wildly through the air, buzzing like angry hornets. When shrapnel hits a soldier, it doesn't puncture, it plows. It acts less like a needle and more like a red-hot garden trowel being forced through flesh. Because the metal is jagged, it drags everything it touches deep into the wound. The soil of France, the mud of Russia, and the filthy wool from your uniform are driven deep into muscle tissue. The heat of the metal cauterizes the wound the moment it tears it open, creating a horrific mixture of burn and laceration. Even if the impact doesn't kill you, the debris lodged deep in your body creates an ideal environment for gas gangrene, a type of bacterial infection that rots living tissue and produces gas bubbles under the skin, leading to amputation or a slow death in fever. However, shrapnel is still a visible killer. There is a far more terrifying fate reserved for those who find themselves at the epicenter of a large caliber impact, such as a 150mm howitzer or naval artillery shell. This is a phenomenon known as vaporization or red mist. If you are standing exactly where the shell lands, biology simply ceases to exist. The transfer of energy is so massive and instantaneous that the human body is structurally obliterated. The terrifying mercy of this death lies in the speed of the nervous system. Nerve impulses carrying pain signals to your brain travel at about 100 meters per second. The speed of the explosion is thousands of meters per second. You are literally destroyed faster than your brain can register the concept of existence. One moment you are a thinking, breathing human being. The next moment you are just a fine mist of biological matter. You don't die, you simply stop. But what if you aren't at the epicenter? What if you are 6 meters away? Safely behind a wall, untouched by any metal fragments, you're still not safe. Still, you are now in the domain of the shockwave, the invisible killer. An explosion creates a sphere of massive pressure, a wall of compressed air moving faster than the speed of sound. This wave passes through solid objects, including your body. The human body is a container of varying densities, solid bone-liquid blood, and gas-filled pockets like lungs and intestines. When a shock wave passes through you, these densities react differently. This velocity differential creates a shearing force inside the organs. This is called blast lung. Without a single scratch on the skin, your lungs can be torn apart from the inside. The delicate alveoli, the tiny air sacs responsible for processing oxygen, rupture instantly due to the pressure spike. You might stand up after the explosion, checking yourself for wounds, and find nothing, thinking you are the luckiest person in the world. But then you try to take a breath. You gasp, but no oxygen enters the blood. Instead, you begin to cough up a pink foam. This is your own blood mixing with the air in your destroyed lungs. You are drowning on dry land, suffocating while surrounded by air as your internal organs hemorrhage into themselves. Your eardrums are blown out, leaving you in a world of silence and ringing tinnitus, while your eyes may fill with blood from ruptured capillaries. The air itself has become a weapon, and against the laws of physics, there is nowhere to hide. We leave the mud of the infantry to enter the realm of machines. World War II was defined by mechanized fury, by tanks and airplanes. For the crews operating them, these vehicles offered a seductive promise of protection. You were surrounded by inches of hardened steel or soaring high above the filth of the battlefield. But do not be fooled. In the physics of destruction, armor is not a shield. It is an energy container. When you step into a tank or strap into a fighter plane, you aren't entering a fortress. You are sealing yourself inside a potential oven, a pressure cooker, and a tomb. First, let's consider the tank, the beast of ground warfare. The common fear is a shell penetrating the armor and exploding inside. That is certainly fatal, but there is a more sinister phenomenon that kills crews without the enemy shell ever entering the cabin. It is called spalling. When a high-velocity anti-tank shell strikes the outside of your turret, even if it doesn't penetrate, the kinetic energy has to go somewhere. It travels through the steel as a shockwave. When that wave reaches the inner wall of the armor, the metal cannot compress any further. Instead, it flakes off. Scabs of steel, razor-sharp and moving at bullet speeds, explode inward from your own vehicle's wall. Essentially, you are trapped inside a giant blender. These metal shards shred flesh and sever hydraulic lines, turning the crew compartment into a chaotic slurry of blood and oil. You are killed by the very armor designed to save you. Then there is the cook-off. If a penetrating hit ignites ammunition or fuel, the tank becomes a blast furnace in seconds. The laws of physics here are cruel. As the fire consumes the oxygen inside the sealed hull, air pressure drops vertically. Crew members often don't die from the flames touching their skin first. They die from asphyxiation or their lungs being cooked by inhaling superheated gas. It is a frantic panic, clawing in the dark, wrestling with hatches that might be jammed while the temperature rises to the point where human proteins begin to denature. Above the clouds, the situation is even lonelier. The pilot's war takes place in a cramped aluminum box strapped to thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. The primary horror here is fire in the slipstream. If a fuel tank is ruptured and ignites the cockpit, doesn't just burn, it becomes a blowtorch. The plane is moving at 300 or 400 miles per hour. This speed forces air into the fire, creating a forced draft incinerator effect. The heat is so intense that aluminum, which melts at about 650 degrees Celsius, begins to liquefy and drip like candle wax. Surviving pilots recount their goggles melting to their faces and leather gloves shrinking, crushing their hands onto the control stick. Instinct says to bail out, but physics works against you there too. This brings us to the machine's final betrayal, G-force. If a plane enters an uncontrolled spin, centrifugal force can pin you to the cockpit wall. You might weigh 90 kilograms on the ground, but in a death spiral, you weigh half a ton. You cannot lift your arms to open the canopy. You cannot move your legs to kick out. You are fully conscious, watching the ground rushing up to meet you, physically paralyzed by the laws of motion. And if you manage to jump without a parachute, or if your chute fails, you face terminal velocity. The human body is not designed to decelerate from 200 kilometers per hour to zero in the space of a few centimeters. Upon impact, the skeletal structure shatters, but the internal organs, heart, liver, brain, continue moving forward due to inertia, tearing themselves loose from connecting arteries. It is a death of total structural collapse. In the era of machine warfare, technology doesn't save you. It only changes the method by which you are erased. We have traversed the ground and the sky, but no battlefield is more indifferent to human life than the ocean. In the naval front of World War II, the sailor faced a unique paradox. He fought on a surface he could not walk on. Surrounding him was water he could not drink. When a ship went down, the war instantly shifted from a conflict of ballistics to a conflict of thermodynamics and chemistry. The ocean does not care what color uniform you wear. It only cares about your body temperature and lung capacity. Let's start with the North Atlantic, the graveyard of convoys. Here, the main killer wasn't the torpedo that sank the ship, but the water itself. When a sailor is thrown into the freezing ocean, he experiences the cold shock response. This is a physiological reflex that kills the victim long before hypothermia sets in. The moment your skin hits the near-freezing water, your body involuntarily gasps. It is an uncontrollable reflex. If your head is underwater when this happens, you don't inhale air. You inhale salt water. Your vocal cords spasm, sealing your airway, and you suffocate while fully conscious. If you survive this initial shock, you have 10, maybe 15 minutes of useful movement. Your body, in a desperate attempt to keep the heart and brain warm, constricts blood vessels in the arms and legs. You lose dexterity. You cannot tie a knot. You cannot climb onto a life raft. You cannot even hold onto floating debris. You watch your own hands turn into useless claws. Then comes the drift. As core temperature drops, you fall into lethargy. It is a lonely, quiet death where you simply drift to sleep and slip beneath the waves, becoming another piece of organic matter in the deep sea. In the Pacific, the nightmare was the exact opposite fire. Naval warfare runs on oil. When a battleship or aircraft carrier is hit, that fuel spills onto the water. Oil is lighter than water, so it floats and it burns. Survivors of shipwrecks often found themselves facing an impossible choice. You can stay underwater holding your breath until your lungs scream for oxygen, or you can surface into a hell on Earth. This is not clean fire. It is thick, choking black smoke mixed with vaporizing fuel. When a sailor surfaces to gasp for air in an oil slick, he inhales superheated soot and toxic gas. This scorches the lining of the throat and lungs instantly. Many men were pulled from the water, with no obvious burns on the outside of their bodies, but they died hours later because they had essentially inhaled fire. Their lungs filled with fluid in a reaction to chemical burns, drowning them from the inside out right on the deck of the rescue ship. Finally, we must dive into the most suffocating death of the war submarines. For the submariner, the hull is the only thing separating him from the crushing weight of the ocean. If a submarine is damaged and sinks to the bottom but remains intact, the crew faces a slow psychological horror as the air scrubbers fail. Carbon dioxide levels rise. This isn't a violent choking, it is a gradual poisoning. The air becomes heavy, headaches set in, followed by lethargy and vivid hallucinations. Men would simply drift into a coma and never wake up buried alive in a steel block at the bottom of the sea. But if the hull is breached at great depth, physics takes over with brutal speed. Water pressure increases by 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At crush depth, the pressure is strong enough to snap steel beams like matchsticks. If the hull is punctured, water doesn't flow in, it hammers in. The pressure differential is so extreme that implosion occurs faster than the speed of sound. The air inside the submarine is compressed instantly, raising the temperature to that of a flash fire, while water crushes the human body. There is no time to drown. There is no time to feel pain. The structural integrity of the human body simply collapses under the weight of the ocean. In a fraction of a second, you are turned into nothingness, obliterated by the sheer mass of water above you. In naval warfare, you either freeze burn or are crushed. There is no middle ground. We have discussed how external forces, metal, fire, and pressure destroy the human form. But there is a quieter, slower, and perhaps more terrifying way to die in World War II. This is the domain of biological erosion, where the enemy is not a soldier on the other side of the line, but your own cells turning against you. In the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front and the starving barbed wire prison camps of the Pacific, death was not an event. It was a process. It stripped away a human's dignity long before it stopped his heart, turning life into a sequence of irreversible decay. Let's look at the physics of deep freezing. The winter of 1941 in Russia saw temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, where the air itself became a lethal weapon. If you were stuck outdoors, the first stage was pain. As the body lost heat, ice crystals formed in the extracellular fluid of fingertips, toes, and noses. These jagged crystals acted like microscopic shards of glass, puncturing cell membranes from the inside, feeling like thousands of needles being driven deep into the flesh. Then came the numbness, which many soldiers welcomed, but it was a false mercy. The body entered emergency triage to save itself. It constricted blood flow to the extremities to keep the heart and lungs warm. Hands and feet turned pale waxy and hard as wood, bereft of living sensation. If tapped against a rifle butt, they made a hollow sound like dry timber. These limbs were already dead, They just hadn't fallen off the body yet. But the most haunting phenomenon occurred right before the end. It is called paradoxical undressing. When core temperature drops to a critical level, the hypothalamus fails. Blood vessels that were constricted suddenly dilate. A massive amount of hot blood from the body's core rushes out to the freezing skin in the final moments of delirium. You no longer feel cold. You feel a searing, unbearable heat as if your body is burning up amidst the white snow. Rescue teams often found frozen soldiers naked, their clothes folded neatly beside them, having died, believing they were being burned alive. If the cold didn't kill you, hunger would. In POW camps and besieged cities like Leningrad, the body was forced into autophagy. This is when the body, a biological machine needing fuel, begins to eat itself. First the fat reserves, then the muscles when all other sources are exhausted. Biceps, thighs, and finally the heart muscle are broken down to convert protein into glucose to keep the brain functioning. You are eating yourself to survive. This degradation brings about the collapse of basic functions. Dysentery becomes the constant companion of the starving and exhausted soldier. The digestive tract weakens from malnutrition and dirty water losing the ability to process food. The intestines atrophy and the body loses control over excretion. Victims uncontrollably excrete bloody fluid. Dignity is wiped clean. Those who once stood tall in uniform are reduced to skin-wrapped skeletons. They lie in their own filth, too weak to lift a hand to clean themselves, reduced to a state of pure biology with no trace of humanity left. The final stage of this erosion is the death of personality. In concentration camps, there was a term for this state, Muselmänner. These were people who had been so starved, frozen, and exhausted that the brain shut down emotional centers. They stopped speaking, stopped moving, and stopped looking at the world. They wore the 1,000-yard stare, looking through you, rather than at you, alive biologically but completely dead psychologically. Finally, they would collapse and die without a sound, without resistance, because the will to exist had been chemically wiped from the brain. This is the cruelest weapon of war, turning human beings into soulless biological objects stripped of hope and waiting for the machine of life to slowly grind to a halt. We have reached the final page of this survival manual. We have analyzed the ballistics that shatter bone, the pressure waves that liquefy organs, the fire that melts aluminum, and the cold that freezes time. We have viewed the battlefield not as a stage for heroism, but as a hostile environment defined by physics, chemistry, and biology. Now, perhaps you are asking yourself, with all this knowledge, with all the warnings about spalling shockwaves and infection, does this manual actually increase your chances of survival? The answer, if we are brutally honest, is no. The scariest truth of World War II was not the weapons, it was the randomness. You could be the best trained soldier in the battalion. You could be a master marksman, physically fit and tactically brilliant. You could do everything right. You could dig your foxhole to the exact depth, keep your head down, and maintain your equipment perfectly. And yet a 150mm shell fired by a teenager 15 kilometers away who never saw your face and didn't know your name could simply wipe you from existence. There is an old military adage that says a bullet may have your name on it, but a grenade is addressed to whom it may concern. In this war, artillery was the distributor of mass death. It didn't care about your skills. It didn't care about your family back home. It was simply a coordinate on a map and a mathematical probability. When the smoke cleared and the treaties were signed, what remained was the transition from individuals to statistics. This is the final death, the death of identity. In the aftermath of the war, over 60 million people ceased to be fathers, sons, engineers, or artists. They became numbers on a spreadsheet. They became white crosses in the fields of Normandy, unmarked graves on the Russian steppes, or coordinates deep beneath the Pacific. The scale of industrial killing meant society had to process death in batches. We build monuments to the unknown soldier, not just to honor them, but because there were simply too many fragments of humanity that could never be identified. The red mist we spoke of earlier leaves no dog tags. The deep ocean returns no bodies. So what is the value of understanding these 1,000 ways to die? It is to strip away the glossy paint of cinema that 80 years of pop culture have applied to this conflict. It is to look at black and white footage of laughing soldiers and realize they were walking on the edge of a biological abyss. It creates a bridge of empathy. When you understand that killed in action could mean freezing to death while hallucinating fire or suffocating in a dark steel tube, you stop seeing them as characters in a story. You start seeing them as fragile biological organisms exactly like you, who were thrown into a meat grinder and asked to hold the line. War is not glorious. It is dirty, It is painful, and it is scientifically horrific. Surviving it is not a testament to skill, it is a testament to luck. And for the millions who did not survive, their silence is the loudest sound in history. Thank you for joining me on this descent into combat reality. If this analysis has given you a new perspective on World War II, if it made history feel a little more real and less like a movie, then this manual has served its purpose. We cover the dark, complex, and untold stories of history here. If you want to be part of the next briefing, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. Leave a comment below on which aspect of war reality surprised you the most. Was it the physics of tanks or the biology of the cold? I will be reading your reports. See you next time. Stay curious, and remember, history is written by the victors, but reality is experienced by the victims. Dismissed.